Welcome to another episode of Art That Plays and Praise. Our discussion today is something very basic, but which I've neglected to talk about until a few viewers asked me questions about it. Today it's all about paper. What paper should you use for your art? There are so many paper choices out in the stores that it's dizzying to make a decision. In this video, I'll help you crack down on the differences between paper types and share some info on which paper you can use for watercolor, markers, acrylic, pastels, or other media. This video is in no way exhaustive, but I hope you can pick up a tip or two from my info dump. Some subscribers ask me for cheap, budget-friendly paper recommendations, but I have this important note to share with you. No matter how high-end and professional your brushes and paints are, if your paper is of substandard quality, you can't produce stunning art. Paper choice is foundational, and it's something you have to seriously consider before laying down the first brush stroke. In fact, it's better economy to scrimp on paint than to scrimp on paper, even if you have a student-grade watercolor pan set. But if you use quality paper that allows your pigments to flow, then you can still create beautiful art. On the other hand, even if you have expensive paints and the kind of Da Vinci red sable brush that will break the bank, painting on photocopy paper or cardstock will not do you any good. Because here's the thing with cheap paper, the moment you apply watercolor in sheet paper, the paper soaks up the paint right away. You don't want that. Yes, you like absorbent paper, but you don't want the absorption to happen too quickly either. As you paint, you want to be able to manipulate the pigments and move them around first. You want to make touch-ups and work on your details before the paint settles into the paper fibers and dries up. This is the reason why in paper manufacturing, we have something called size or sizing. And I'm not talking about paper dimensions like 9-inch by 12-inch paper or a 10 by 14 size. That's not what I'm talking about here. Sizing is the substance added to the paper as a protective glaze or a surface sealant. What does it do exactly? Basically, it retards absorption. Size agents slow down the ability of paper fibers to absorb inks, water, grease, oil, and other liquids. Sizing makes the surface of the paper less porous so that watercolors or inks don't permeate too fast. Size is important because, like I said, you want your inks or paint to stay on the surface of the paper and to dry there, rather than to sink inside the fibers where you lose the vibrancy and color saturation of your painting. Imagine writing on paper only to see the ink bleed through. You don't like that. If you write on sized paper, your lines will look sharply detailed and crisp. But if you write on untreated paper, your lines will feather and branch sideways, just like what happens when you pour ink on paper towels or blotting paper. Sizing additives have to be both water-loving or hydrophilic and water-repelling or hydrophobic. It's a balancing act. The hydrophobic side of the size agent's molecules face outwards. That's why we have water-resistant paper. The most common sizing agent is natural gelatin, which comes from animal bones and animal hide. Sometimes paper manufacturers use starch from wheat, rice, or potatoes, or they use egg whites. Other manufacturers prefer gelatin size because it adds surface strength and flexibility to paper. Sometimes you'll find watercolor paper that's advertised as tub-sized, like Arches watercolor paper. What that means is that the sheets of paper were soaked in a tray of sizing solution and left there for a few minutes. So as you can imagine, the sizing agent penetrates internally right into the wet pulp. Paper that is not treated with size agents are called water leaf. The paper fibers are hydrophilic and are thus extremely porous. In layman's English, that just means the paper will soak up and all the inks and all the paints you lay down will just disappear. Artists call this bleed through. Sometimes we see the results as feathering when we write with ink. Paper towels, blotting paper, and tissues are unsized. That's why they absorb moisture very well. Now, watercolor paper comes in 3 types. There's hot press, cold press, and rough. The type of surface they have depends on how well they were compressed during the manufacturing process. Hot press paper is molded on heated cylinders and is compressed firmly with more pressure compared to cold press paper. Since hot press paper is more compressed, more of the pigments you see on it, the ones you put on it, will sit on the surface. Only a little of the paint penetrates or bleeds into the paper. Cold press paper, on the other hand, is molded using unheated rollers and are then semi-compressed. Meanwhile, rough paper are very loosely compressed, and that's why they show off as a bit bumpier on the surface. Think of it like you're ironing clothes. How much wrinkles you take out of your clothes depends on the temperature you set on your iron and how much pressure you apply on the fabric. I only use hot and cold press paper, so in this video, that's all I can discuss. Which one do you pick and what's the difference? The most visible contrast between the two is the paper surface. If you inspect closely, cold press paper is more textured, and you can see the little peaks and valleys like the paper is a hilly landscape. Hot press paper, on the other hand, has a smoother, more satiny finish. Cold press paper tends to absorb more paint because the fibers are not as compact as hot pressed. The tooth on cold press paper makes it the perfect choice if you want to add soft pastels or pan pastels to your watercolor painting, because the dimples on cold press also allow it to carry more pigments, so it's easier to blend colors and play around as you paint. This makes cold press paper more beginner friendly. It's more forgiving, and cold press can be sympathetic to pen and ink details, but you just have to apply your lines with a more steady hand. I found that it took me a bit more time and practice to get comfortable with hot press paper because it dries faster and doesn't always give me the watercolor blooms that I like to experiment with. It's also more difficult to layer paints on hot press paper. Since the pigments sit more on the surface than inside the fibers, it's easier to lift and disturb the underpainting and retouch what you don't want touched. Choosing between hot or cold is a matter of preference. The smoothness of hot press paper makes it desirable for inking like in urban sketches because pens and markers glide faster and better on top of hot press paper, producing cleaner lines or strokes with sharper edges. This is crucial if your drawing requires precision and detail like in architectural sketches. You don't want your pens to trip up and snag on any bumps, right? For detailed brushwork, you'll do better with hot press as well. Hot press paper is also ideal if you plan to scan your paintings and touch them up digitally using Photoshop, because then the paper's tooth won't be a visual impediment and won't look like there's added noise you need to despeckle or blur in Photoshop. If you're confused on whether to pick hot or cold press and you don't have money to experiment with both, you might want to buy watercolor paper that's double textured. This means that one side is rough while the flip side is smooth. And I know Arches and Canson sells such types of paper pads. Watercolor paper comes in different types of binding. Some are wire bound on the side, so it looks like an art journal. There are micro perforations on the bound edge, and it's there so you can tear off the paper if you want to frame your art or put it elsewhere. If it is not wire bound, some watercolor paper are glued on paper pads or come as unbound individual sheets. Most artists prefer pads because they're relatively cheaper. You can easily tear off sheets and lay them flat on a board using painter's masking tape. Watercolor paper pads are glued on one side, but there are also watercolor blocks, which are bound on two opposite sides or on all four edges. Some artists prefer blocks because they're easy to carry around for plein air painting when you want to paint while traveling. You don't run the risk of wrinkling the edges of your paper when you stuff the block in your bag. The paper is also stretched when they're gummed all around, and stretch paper doesn't buckle as much when wet. So what do you do with a block? You might ask that. You can paint directly on the paper block and then detach the sheet using a palette knife when your painting has dried already. The block I bought came with a separator. See this? It's so cute. It looks like a bent leaf. With a block, there's only about an inch or two of opening where you insert your palette knife. From here, you slide around the edges to separate the glue binding. There's a bit of a resistance here, so you have to be careful not to damage the paper. I know most people buy blocks so they can paint while the paper is stretched, but I've seen artists make the mistake of painting and then tearing their art by accident while detaching the sheet. I often worry about making that mistake, so I sort of prefer to detach first and tear off the sheet first, then paint afterwards, rather than paint first before removing the paper. I kind of know, I know that defeats the purpose of buying watercolor blocks, but I'd rather stretch paper by taping it on a sturdy board, but whichever way you want to use a block is totally up to you. Now let's talk about the weight of paper. How heavy should paper be to do its job well? The math behind paper weight calculations can be mind-boggling. For us who are not paper manufacturers, we see on the paper pad a measurement in pounds and a measurement in GSM or grams per square meter. Which one do we follow? Let me show you what I mean. Take a look at this pad of mixed media paper and this pad of watercolor paper. Both are 300 GSM. But why are the pounds different? Isn't that confusing? One method of identifying paper thickness is called the US basis weight, which measures paper in pounds. For watercolor paper, for instance, you can see on the cover if it is 90 pounds, 140 pounds, 300 pounds, or 400 pounds. But that number doesn't refer to the weight of the 20 or 25 legal sheets or letter size pad you bought. That number applies to the weight of 500 sheets of uncut paper, and that weight changes depending on the paper type. And there are so many different categories of paper, like bond paper is of a different category from Bristol paper or index cards or the paper used for books. So you see, the standards can be so ambiguous for simple-minded people like me because apparently the 90 pounds of watercolor paper may not be of the same thickness as the 90 pounds of a different category of paper. Fortunately, there's another method for weighing paper that's a bit more uniform. It's called the metric system, and it uses GSM or grams per square meter as the unit of measure. Grammage is the actual weight of one sheet of square paper that's cut with dimensions of 1 meter by 1 meter. And since we're comparing the same paper size of 1 square meter, regardless of paper type, there's a sense of uniformity that can help us gauge better if the media we're buying is actually heavyweight or lightweight. Why did I go into such a lengthy discussion of paper weight? What it boils down to is this. When buying paper, look at the GSM, not at the pounds. Compare GSMs and decide on the basis of GSM. Because a Strathmore mixed media paper, for example, which is advertised as 90 pounds, may not seem favorable to you when pitted against another brand that's 98 pounds. But when you compare their GSMs, you might be surprised that Strathmore is in fact 30 grams heavier. The most common weight for watercolor paper is 140 pounds, equivalent to 300 GSM. There are lighter paper pads, but if you want better results in your painting, I suggest you never settle for anything less than 140 pounds or 300 GSM. Good paper should be of higher priority in your budget than good paint medium. Generally, the heavier the watercolor paper is, the more expensive it is, and the better it is in withstanding heavy washes of watercolor without warping, shriveling, or twisting out of shape. In other words, the more heavyweight the paper, the more water it can tolerate. If you plan to use lightweight paper, maybe for practice, keep in mind that this is prone to buckling, and when paper curls, it tends to form puddles here and there, which may mess up your work and lengthen drying time. That said, with lightweight paper, go easy on the water. If you want to paint without constantly worrying whether or not you've overly soaked your sheets, then go for a 300-pound watercolor paper. It's the heaviest and can survive heavy washes and any abuse, short of tearing the paper to pieces, of course. It may buckle a bit while you're working, but normally 300-pound paper eventually flattens when they dry. Now let's talk about wood pulp versus cotton. If you want to be a serious watercolorist, only pick paper that says acid-free. Wood pulp naturally contains an acidic substance called lignin, which is found in the cell walls of plants. This organic component is a culprit behind the yellowing of paper. Imagine old newspapers or documents from the 19th century that became brittle and crumbled to the touch. That kind of deterioration in paper quality is what happens when the natural acids in wood pulp are not neutralized to a pH of 7 or more. Nowadays, manufacturers produce acid-free and lignin-free paper. Pay attention to the end. Always look for acid-free and lignin-free paper, because even though a product is acid-free, but if it still has lignin content, that paper will eventually become acidic again. Lignin is a complex polymer that causes acid to form again on paper. When exposed to sunlight and oxygen, the lignin molecules become unstable and turn brown or yellow. Technically, lignin itself isn't the problem. The problem is oxidation. So if you've discovered a way to keep paper from oxygen-rich environments, then you don't have to worry about yellowing paper products. But of course, that's impossible. So the bottom line is only buy paper that is advertised as archival. Sometimes you can read it on the label as archival grade or museum grade. Keep in mind, acidic paper can last anywhere between 25 to 50 years, but acid-free paper can last for hundreds of years. What about cotton paper or cotton rag paper? 100% cotton fiber provides the best painting surface for watercolor, so it's not surprising that many professional artists gravitate more towards cotton than cellulose paper. Cotton is best appreciated for its durability, so any painting made on cotton paper has greater chances of permanence. They don't fade, they don't discolor over time, and so quality cotton fibers can last for hundreds of years. 100% cotton can be found in Arches watercolor paper, in Winsor and Newton, in the B Paper Company's watercolor paper and watercolor art journals, and in Strathmore's 500 series. Fabriano Studio has a blend of cotton and cellulose, but the Fabriano Artistico line contains 100% cotton. Canson Aquarelle only has 60% cotton content. The XL line of Canson has no cotton at all. It's only wood pulp. But the Canson Heritage line is 100% cotton, and so is Canson's flagship product, the Moulin du Roi. Just like Arches, the Moulin du Roi is both internally sized and surface sized, and it comes in weights of 300 and 640 GSM, thus catering more to the professionals, the professional artists. I guess what I'm saying is that there are tons of cotton papers already available in the market, so it wouldn't be too difficult to source. Some are cheaper, like the one made by B Paper, and yet perform extremely well, so don't be afraid to test a few sheets yourself. I suggest you buy the smallest pads so you can find until you've narrowed down your search to the brand you really love to settle with. Just buy the smallest pads. Many artists complain about paper pilling at the edges of painter's tape or liquid frisket. Some complain that painter's tape, washi tape, masking tape, or masking fluid, they stick too strongly that when it comes time to remove them, the paper tears. I know this happened with a Speedball Fluid 100 cold press paper, but let's test Arches and Canson to see if they behave well. I'm going to perform a painter's tape and masking fluid test, and I'll use Cotton XL. What am I talking about? Canson XL cold press watercolor paper. I'll also try the Arches hot press watercolor paper. Both of these are 300 GSM, and but one is hot and the other is cold. One is wood pulp and the other is cotton fiber. You might ask me, what is liquid frisket? A frisket is just another term for masking fluid. They're one and the same. And we use it to protect areas of our art that we don't want to paint over. The frisket creates a water-resistant film, so you can safely pass your paints over it and the latex won't absorb the colors. I'll show you how it's used. I'll apply this using a cheap brush. it would have been better if I used a color shaper, which essentially looks like a paintbrush, except that the tip is made of silicone or rubber instead of hair bristles. But I wasn't able to grab my silicone for this video, so this brush will do. Keep in mind, masking fluid is formulated with latex and ammonia, and it can destroy bristles if left to dry. So make sure to wash your brush thoroughly when you're done. Whatever is covered by the masking fluid will retain the whiteness of the paper underneath. Later, when this frisket is fully dried, I'll rub this off and you'll see the effect. I'm now going to apply watercolor washes using my flat brush. Please note that I'm not aiming for perfection here. For washes to look perfectly smooth and less streaky, it's best to tape down the paper on a board to prevent the paper from shifting. It's also recommended to apply the paint while your board is tilted at an angle to prevent hard lines from forming, because you're using gravity to pull the liquid downwards. But as you can see, I've taped these papers on my table, so I couldn't slant them. Anyway, my goal here is to see how well the paper absorbs water and to test if Arches or Canson paper buckles and by how much it buckles. That's why I didn't tape down the other two sides of this paper. I just want to show you what happens if we keep soaking these up. How much curling are we going to get? I'm intentionally creating pools of paint on both the Canson and the Arches to see how the fibers behave. So pardon the unevenness of this wash and all the hard edges and paint blooms I didn't fix. I'm focusing more on the product review than on the artistic merits of this demo. In case you're wondering what are paint blooms, well, paint blooms or watercolor blooms happen when water flows from an area of heavy moisture to an area of less wetness. These blooms look like cauliflowers and can be unpredictable. Some people call them backruns, and many artists consider blooms as mistakes. But honestly, I love them. Those splotchy markings add unique textures to a painting, and I find them so pretty. Anyway, I digress. Let's just check out the results of our tests. As you might have suspected already, over-soaking will definitely buckle watercolor paper. But from the comparison here, you can see that the warping is more pronounced on the Canson cold press paper than on the Arches hot press. And that's to be expected because of the nature of cold press paper. Because the paper fibers are less compressed and there's more tooth to trap in moisture, cold press can really drink up a lot of more fluids than hot press paper. But don't worry, with brands like Canson and Strathmore, buckling is temporary. They always dry flat than this, much flatter than this. Just give it some time. Now let's look closely at the paper edges. When I removed the masking tape, the painting was still damp. Notice how a tiny fleck of fiber lifted from the Canson. I'm not sure you can see it on the video, but there's a bit of lifting that happened here. It's quite negligible, and unless you're really nitpicky, that tiny damage is not a big deal. Now with the Arches, there's no visible damage after removing the sticky tape. Everything still looks perfect. Well, that tiny speck on the top was an imperfection caused by my watercolor wash. I think the size agent resisted the paint right there. Now, how about the masking fluid? Let's take this off. As you can see, I'm using a hair dryer to speed up the drying of this masking fluid, but I set this dryer to cool, not warm, and definitely not hot. The dryer is at low setting as well, so it's like I'm just blowing this thing with my mouth. It's not advisable to use heat with frisket because doing so will cause the latex to adhere to the paper. My goal is to peel off the frisket afterwards and not just leave this here. As you can see, I'm rubbing really hard, but none of the paper fibers are affected. This Winsor & Newton masking fluid is an excellent product to begin with, but so are these papers. They take abuse pretty well. At this point, I want to talk about lint. Can we scrub paper without producing lint? One problem with cheap paper is that while you push your paint with your brush, as bristles abrade the wet paper, some paper fibers lift off of the surface. They bunch up so you sort of have rolled up lint all over the top of your art. Picture in your mind the look of pilling on polyester sweaters. Your painting will look something like that when you work with cheap paper. I want to test how Canson and Arch behave when it comes to pilling. I am scrubbing with my fingers while the paper is still soaking wet. I want to deliberately test the strength of the paper because Canson asserts that their products have a durable surface, but how true is that claim? I actually feel roughness forming under my fingers here, but Arch is still smooth. Well, you can see there's still some pilling in the surface here. You can take a look. Now let's talk about marker paper. Blending with markers is not as fluid and easy as blending watercolors. With watercolors, the pigment and the water flow and merge on their own, even without help from your brushes. But with markers, you have to be deliberate and you have to work fast before the ink layers dry. That said, you want your marker paper to be smooth. You don't want friction to work against you as you blend your colors. Good marker paper should be smooth enough to allow markers to glide. Rough paper can cause damage to brush pens. Frayed brush pens won't produce clean strokes and well-defined edges, and you don't want that, especially if you're doing calligraphy. Aside from smoothness, good marker paper should also be surface-sized well to avoid feathering and bleed-through. A lot of decent paper receive water-based inks pretty well, but the problem shows up with stronger alcohol inks that are notorious for bleeding. That's why it's difficult to find a suitable paper for Copic markers or Shinhan Touch markers. A lot of people ask me what I use, and for the longest time, I stuck with this Copic brand paper. This is the best I've tried, but since the sheets are too pricey and are often out of stock, I was forced to experiment with a cheaper alternative. Strathmore is a strong performer in the paper market, and their products they've always been reliable and adaptable to both beginner and professional artists. As I'm making comparative swatches here, see for yourself that there's not much difference between this paper and the Copic brand. Both receive pigments well, and as you can see, there's only minimal ghosting, hardly any actually. And to think I'm pressing down hard on these Copic sketch markers, I'm really scrubbing the paper here, yet there are no inks wasted. Nothing sinks all the way through to the back. I put these sheets on top of photocopy paper just in case the markers act up and smudge my table, but as you've witnessed here, there's nothing to worry about. The bond paper is clean. So go ahead and try the Strathmore 400 series marker paper at 190 GSM. It's a cheaper substitute and comes in a variety of sizes per pad. There are larger ones than this, like the 9x12 and the 11x14 inches. How about pastel paper? I've often been asked also what paper I use for pastels. For soft pastels or pan pastels, I'm comfortable with Canson Mitant. This 160 GSM paper is dual surface, which means that one side is rougher than the other side. The heavily textured side is absolutely fantastic in grabbing pigments. The paper is so rigid and sturdy yet very versatile. There are multiple layering possibilities with this paper because Canson Mitant can accept graphite, charcoal, inks, soft and hard pastels, and even watercolors, surprisingly, which is what I did with this piece. My underpainting is watercolor, then I topped it with pan pastels. The flip side of this paper has a lighter texture which works well for colored pencils or oil pastels. What I have in my stash is the honeycomb structured one, but Canson Mitant also comes in a sanded version that's 350 GSM thick and feels gritty. The quality is superb, but the price is also somewhat steeper. So if you have the money to spend anyway, I suggest you upgrade with a Clairefontaine Pastel Matte instead. I currently don't have stocks to show you on this video because my Pastel Matte is still flying in from UK, but Pastel Matte is the best paper in my opinion because it doesn't produce too much dust when you color with soft pastels. The paper also retains all the fine details you want to draw. The pigments don't get lost in the layering, even when you rub your fingers and try to smudge them up. For oil pastels, I like thick mixed media paper. Paper that's smooth because I can blend colors easily without having to push my pastels down too hard. The more texture the paper, the harder it is to fill in the peaks and valleys with oil pastels. So you'll end up with a lot of white spaces on your painting where your crayons didn't sink into. That said, the art will look speckled and unfinished, unless that's the effect you're aiming for. If you want to keep an unbroken surface and achieve a more uniform coverage of color on heavily textured paper, you'll need linseed oil to blend the oil pastels. Either that, or you can keep rubbing with your fingers. But at a certain point, if you keep rubbing, your hand would cramp and it would be too uncomfortable for you to paint. So the best advice is to use less textured paper for oil pastels and pick the heavyweight type that can hold up to many layers of paint. Okay, about brands. Opinions on paper are as widely diversified as the techniques and painting styles of artists. One person's experience and opinion about paper choices should always be taken with a grain of salt. That said, what I've shared with you in this video and all my brand recommendations based on my years of experimenting with different media, they may or may not work for you. At the end of the day, you still need to try on your own to see if you like the feel of the paper you're using. There are so many paper types and so many brands that it's really difficult for me to pin down just one recommendation. I'm kind of biased towards Arches, and I like both their hot and cold press paper. I'm also a fan of Strathmore 400 series or 500 series. Canson is more on the student grade side, and it's a cheaper alternative for art studies and practice. But brand loyalty aside, I advise that in buying paper, focus instead on GSM. Choose the highest GSM you can afford. You can leave the student grade papers for practice, but do yourself a favor and hone your skills on good quality, heavyweight paper. The truth is, there's no point in learning painting techniques on cheap paper and getting frustrated about not getting it right. Then when you think you've mastered the painting basics on cheap paper and decide it's time to graduate to higher quality professional grade paper, you realize that you need to recalibrate your techniques and tweak what you learned to match the behavior of the new set of papers you bought. So what's the point of going through all of that laborious cycle? That's a roundabout way to learn. So be smart and cut the learning curve by using quality paper already from the get-go, even if you're still a student. Now, here's the second point I want to leave with you before we end this video. Always choose acid-free and lignin-free. Anything besides archival quality is not worth your precious painting time. Even if you're just practicing, choose archival paper. When I was a newbie painter 4 decades ago, I made the mistake of painting at the back of an old calendar. I just needed scrap paper for practice. I didn't take myself seriously then, but the painting turned out so fine that I regretted not creating a better paper that I could preserve. That watercolor is gone now. I have a faint memory of how it looks, but I wish I could show it to my kids now and tell them, well, this was Mama's first painting as a kid. Oh well. Now, last advice. Buy 100% cotton paper if you plan to work with watercolors. It doesn't matter if it's hard press, cold press, or rough. Cotton paper is the best in terms of absorption, performance, and preservation. Like I said earlier, there are a few things you don't want your paper to do. One is to pill, which happens when you have rolled up lint forming on the surface as you scrub with a wet brush or as you erase your drawings on paper. Second, you don't want the paper to bleed through, which means the paint sinks into the paper. Last, you don't want the paper to curl out of shape. You don't want any type of distortions, whether it's twisting or forming waves, as long as your finished art doesn't dry flat. That's not ideal. Now, these 3 things, pilling, bleeding, and warping, are less likely to happen with good quality 100% cotton paper. So, choose cotton. Okay, after all that I've said and shown you, the last and most important point of all of this is have fun. If you got intimidated by my info dump today, just close the video and forget I said anything. Seriously, painting should be fun. So go out there and enjoy the discovery. All right, that's it for now. This is Ginger signing off. Thanks for your patience in watching this long video. Please help this channel thrive by subscribing. Bye and God bless you.